They're all coming to terms with how to deal with the uncertainty that's omnipresent, and they're really trying to identify who the credible messengers are. That sense of the loss of childhood experiences and joy is also profound. As we engage with youth and families, I think that becomes the number one thing that we hear about. And it's really highlighted what I've long believed, and that is that health and education are integrated and inseparable. Access, inclusion, the predeterminants of health include education, and health and wellness are key to the foundations of learning and engagement. So in addition to learning loss, we're seeing a lack of access to routine health care. Immunization compliance is significantly low. Food insecurity is much higher. And these inequities of access, inclusion, and belonging are deeply profound too. And just as one example, our data shows a need for still remaining need of about 38,000 computing devices for children and families, and several thousand hotspots are still needed, while we're also wrestling with the need for longer term infrastructure build out. So, as we think about this impact, I think it's the immediate term impact, that urgency of response. And at the same time, we're holding space for a longer term sustained response, and maybe trying to deal with some of these exacerbated inequities in a way that could lead to true systemic change. In terms of our relationship here in Santa Clara County with the Public Health Department, it is quite robust and strong. And we share staffing, and we've been able to pull together a really strong team to respond and provide information to our community. And we're continuing to find ways, levers, leverage points and opportunities to get information out and available to the community, because we do see education and public health as credible messengers. And if we want to protect the long-term health of our community, we need to be stepping up in these ways as the reliable, credible messengers for our children and families.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that is an important thing to call out, is the trusted messengers of education in addition to public health officials. Since we're talking philanthropy and education, Avo and Tamara, I wanted to hear from you as education funders, how, as COVID has turned out to be much longer, I think, than many of us had anticipated, how is your funding approach? How did it shift in kind of the short term when we saw shelter-in-place orders in March? What were some immediate shifts that you saw or that you took as a foundation? And what do you think that this will look like, or the impact that this will have on how you fund moving forward in this space? Avo, do you want to start from the Community Foundation perspective?
Sure. Thank you, Julie, and thank you to our panelists on the virtual stage. I'm happy to share it with you and share some thoughts. Julie, on that question, I'd say two things popped up for me as Superintendent Magee and Dr. Dewan were talking. One is the fact that this crisis has many tentacles that we don't yet know about, but we do know that these tentacles are going to be long, and the tail of this crisis is going to be long, number one. And number two, to Dr. Dewan's point, is having trusted messengers also brings up another term that philanthropy has been talking about for a while, and that's trust-based philanthropy. So those two things around having a long tail, but also ensuring that there's trust between philanthropy and those who are going to use those resources to get us back to a new normal, I think come together in that, philanthropy and SBCF in particular is shifting how we think about grant making. And in particular, I'd like to say that I'm happy to note that things like our agreements that we have with the 2 county offices of education are such that they are not based on a very specific criteria or scope of work. It simply is what we call a master grant agreement that recognizes that there's a long tail to this crisis. And so there's no definitive end dates. There's no specific scopes of work. It goes to Dr. Dewan's point about trust. And we trust our experts in the field to tell us what's needed, and we just need to be there for the funding. So that's number one. And number two, I'd say the other thing that the crisis has brought up for us is something that I'd love to see all of philanthropy and corporations and others think about: our relationship building and even pre-qualified sort of partners in the field that you can fund immediately at the time of crisis. And we have a number of those agreements in place as a community foundation, but we really hope that those who are involved in philanthropy think about the next crisis, and that part of their emergency operations plan includes an emergency philanthropy plan, so that money can flow to school districts, to nonprofits, and other providers in the field immediately, rather than having to figure out who's doing what the scopes of work are, and so forth. So I think those are the two big shifts for us, is focused on more trust-based philanthropy, and also the recognition that we need to be prepared for the next crisis as a foundation and have more relationships in place.
Thanks, Avo. I think the no SOW and no end dates is very novel, and I think it's something we could all consider. What does that mean? And really, if you think about trust-based philanthropy, identifying partners early on, regardless of the issue happening in the community, won't be an issue, because you've already identified and built those relationships and spend the time to nurture that relationship, that it's a switch that you can turn on and off, as opposed to saying which specific organization works within this line of work, and now I'm going to go find them and ask them to do a bunch of work when they're probably busier than they've ever been before. So thanks for that, Avo.
Yeah, the due diligence can happen before a crisis, not right after the crisis. So
definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Tamara, what about for Shortino? What I know you have been able to make some impressive changes recently in light of COVID, and how do you hope to maintain some of those perhaps through that a long-term perspective?
Hi, Julie. Thank you. And hey, what's up, everybody? Good morning. I'm a parent of 4 school-age children, and so I'm super happy to be here. Shout out to my husband taking care of business in the crying room. So anyways, and humor is part of my medicine, so please know that I know these are really serious times, but I do want to make sure that I acknowledge that it takes a lot for each one of us to be present in this Zoom room. Okay, so check it out. Shortino is one of these very small, very traditional, pretty conservative in approach foundations. It's a family foundation, but there's no family on the board. And it's quite small, yes, and has primarily used program-specific grants for its entire existence. So unfortunately, coming on to this organization, I had been talking about the Whitman Institute's trust-based philanthropy. So I have a lot of gratitude to the Whitman Institute and the 10+ years of research that formed trust-based philanthropy. If that's something that you're unfamiliar with, you can check it out. And they have a whole logic model about it. Part of my seasoned, salty past life as an executive director of nonprofits would say it's just common sense as to how philanthropy should behave in partnership with the nonprofit and education sector. So anyway, so those are just kind of some preliminary thoughts about that. Here's what happened at Shortino. March 12th, 13th, we sheltered in place, right? And within 2 days, I love to tell this story, Veronica Goey, who's the executive director of the Grail Family Services in the east side of San Jose in the Mayfair community, she texted me and said, what is Shortino going to do about this crisis? And mind you, Veronica is a friend of mine. So, but also if you know Veronica Goey, you know she is not playing ever. And I said, oh, I've got this message. And I know I'm going to start getting messages like this. So what I did was I put together two options for my board. I said, here's what you have to do. You either are going to give to one of these funds, or we're going to convert all program-specific grants to general operating support. We had already for 2 years been talking about trust-based philanthropy and that framework. Super thankful for that framework because my board already knew about it. And we had a vote within 10 days of the crisis or the shelter in place being called within 10 days. We had a vote, they voted for it. It was a little bit difficult because it is a very different approach for Shortino. And the ability that we had to go to grantees and say, don't worry, you've been a grantee for a long time with Shortino, we trust you. We know that you don't know what's gonna happen next. Do what you need to do. And literally being on the phone or on Zoom with people in tears, just saying thank you. And you know, from my position saying, no, thank you for being out there. This is the least that we can do. So that was one of the first immediate, I will say this to the audience, we did hear back from different grantees that it wasn't always the case in philanthropy, and I'm still hearing this because I do maintain a lot of different conversations with grantees, that some in philanthropy are still looking at them kind of strangely when they ask, can we shift to general operating support? So for any room that I'm in, I let people know in philanthropy, please consider general operating support, even pragmatically. It's a no-cost solution. I mean, it's not going to cost you more money if it's the same amount of money. So anyways, I'll pause there, Julie, because clearly I am up on my soapbox about this.
I love your soapbox, Tamara. So I think that gives two potential solutions, right? Or two ways to think about it. So either if you are prepared and willing and ready to do that due diligence in advance of something like this happening, you've got your individual grantees that are ready to go, and it would behoove you to convert that to general operating support where possible. I'm not going to tell people what to do. Or you can look at an organization like the Community Foundation that says, we will take this kind of due diligence piece over. We will create these different fundraising mechanisms so that you're not trying to vet organizations. We'll be the central organization that has those relationships, that pursues those relationships. So there were kind of two lines of thought that if you don't have the time, you don't feel comfortable moving towards an organization by organization solution, perhaps you're looking at those funds that exist that, again, take the administrative burden off of the individual organizations from having to complete a survey or an application for every funder for emergency funding. So those are maybe two potential options to think about when you think about disaster relief grant making, as we've seen it play out during COVID. You know, Superintendent Magee, you mentioned this thought of during times of emergency, there's a will and an ability to move quickly, to cut through the red tape, to make things happen. What are examples of this that you kind of see as shining lights, and how do we maintain this sense of urgency, this nimbleness moving forward?
Well, it's interesting because you take a system like education, which really is, operates in so many codes and laws and legislative, mandates. And so moving a system of people who are sort of calibrated to follow inside those boundaries is one of the challenges. But again, it all comes down to trust. If you, as a County Office of Education, I know Superintendent Dewan and I are similar in that we, really try to maintain strong relationships with our districts and provide them the kinds of supports they need. So by us taking sort of the lead on making suggestions about, yes, you can actually go out and serve a student with an IEP, even though it may not be following all of the current federal legislation, and against the sort of general threat of ultimate litigation. So that's the kind of like intense landscape we've been operating in. But one of the great things is that I think this has surfaced that in many cases, we really do operate around the needs of children and families. That in the end, we're able to drop away from those legislative drivers with a promise of, oh, there's a waiver coming. But a family right now today needs this, this, and this. So we worked directly with our school districts to solve those solutions. We also worked with our health officer, who has been a great partner in supporting the needs of school districts. So we shaped our school modification orders to make sure that our school campuses were open for delivery and distribution of food. We repurposed our staffing, say bus drivers to actually deliver devices and food to families when they couldn't get out during the shelter in place. And so these are the kinds of things as of what can we do and how can we help you do it. It's just an example of the spirit. There's always that, thought of, well, ultimately this is all going to catch up with us and the system is going to, surround us again and provide some guidance. But in the moment, we've been able to keep moving forward as a county office of education, leading our districts, providing legal guidance as part of our capacity for our local districts.
Thank you. And I'm going to move us along quickly because somehow a half an hour turns into like the shortest amount of time ever. I want to, building on this idea of moving with a sense of purpose in an emergency, being able to respond quickly. One of the things that we talked about during prep is kind of how, during this time when teachers are being asked the world of them, administrators are being asked the world of them, how do we give districts the space and nonprofit organizations the space and the time to breathe and think about what the new post-COVID education landscape would look like. Becky Pringle this morning in the keynote said, we need to make sure that students, regardless of their background, have what they need when they need it. And right now we're moving at warp 1000. So Superintendent Dewan or Superintendent Magee, what are ideas of how do we give space to folks to be able to have that brainstorming as opposed to just responding in the kind of near term to what's happening to students and families being impacted?
I think to start that conversation, it's really about creating space for teams. It is investing in and highly valuing the time that teachers, administrators, communities, and others need to have. So, I think so often in the past, we haven't paid people to do that type of reflection and practice and process. And we also maybe haven't really invested in ways of sharing information more broadly or systemically, so that it really has been upon the individual to seek out information or to seek out additional training or resources. So I think a few of the things that we've been able to do with the support of Philanthropy has been to shift into platforms and venues and opportunities for voice very rapidly, and also to pay individuals for some of their expertise during this time, and even just giving them time to develop curriculum and to vet resources and to consider the ways that are going to be needed to engage in families and children in their education. I think it's really important, though, that we not lose space for just as a whole community education, and likewise coming to terms with some of the underlying reasons for these inequities and keeping the focus on equity as we do that and sustaining that focus throughout the pandemic and beyond. And maybe also creating community and statewide conversations that allow us to shift our focus or shift our relationship with some things and from maybe the way we used to do it in the past. So one example is, really shifting our beliefs about access to the internet and access to broadband. We've often, I think, considered it a luxury, or considered, ways in which it could be optional, or that there's, different piecemeal ways in order to access the internet. But what we've learned during the pandemic is that it is really essential that everyone have equitable access to high quality internet in order to stay healthy, in order to access services and the like. And I believe that it's those types of reflections that will impact the system, will impact the way that we're funded, that will also help us reimagine the delivery of education in the future.
You're muted.
Once a day, and it had to be right now. I was going to say, Superintendent Magee, do you have additional, I know you're passionate about providing people with a space to be creative. Would you like to kind of share more about what that means for you in San Mateo County?
Yeah, we've had a complete lack of space since this emergency happened. Everyone has been 24/7 around the clock, all hands on deck. We were able to launch up a partnership with the community college district in June to provide distance learning training for many of our teachers in the county. But again, it involved over like 30 or 35 staff members internally to make that happen. There was a lot of crying on both ends of the day every day. So, but we did it. And so I do believe that we need to invest in people to do this work, to create space. So at the County Office of Education, to have a staff member whose job is to navigate the worlds between the community, the nonprofit world, and our districts, makes that trusted partner highway so much easier to travel on. And right now, we just don't have that bandwidth to support that kind of position. But especially going forward now with the opportunity to rebuild a system that is genuinely equitable and serves, gives students what they need when they need it. That's the kind of thing that we would need in education.
Thank you. And as our attendee, Peter, points out, this is often something that philanthropy is hesitant to fund. It doesn't feel comfortable with overhead or staffing that's essential to run these programs. Tamara or Ava, do you have any comments on how do we shift philanthropy? I know I'm lumping it and acting like it's a behemoth that all makes the same decisions, but what opportunity is there? How do we make that shift and help convince decision makers that this is an important investment to make now and in the future?
Yeah, I'll go first and say that I'm happy that we took the steps prior to really take a close look at all the data collection that the Shortino Family Foundation was, I mean, I'll be very frank, I came on board, I'm the full-time employee, the one full-time employee, and I could not believe how much information was collected from grantees. And I looked all over the office for the data analyst and I couldn't find them. So I came back to the board and I said, I don't know what you did with this information, but it just was collected and I don't see the analysis. So, all right, so if you haven't done that, moving forward, what are you going to do? And what we do is ask, what information do you have to collect? What is critical for you to know? What information are you collecting for other funders? And we've been having that conversation for 2 years, so I'm grateful. And you're absolutely right. I think that philanthropy, especially right now, needs to put money on the table and to have trust and understand the organizations, the districts, the teachers, the nonprofits, everyone is doing their absolute best. And I know that's not necessarily, I know there are still foundations who do need to have programmatic outcomes, and I think that is very possible. I think it's possible, but it has to be done in collaboration. And we have to acknowledge the power dynamic, right? That I'm really grateful to Veronica who said, what are you going to do? And so I say to other grantees, this is a time when you do need to pressure funders and say, what are you going to do differently? End rant. Avo?
Tamara, thank you for that. You totally hit it home for me too. I think for us, one is, any organization giving money away has overhead expenses, and to expect the folks that you're giving money to not to have those overhead expenses is crazy. And so I would just look within ourselves before we question whether overhead expenses are justified, because it's just nuts. Otherwise, philanthropy should just stand on the corner of the street and give cash to people directly. So if that's what they want to do, that's my thought on it. But a big shout out to Genentech to answer the first question, Julie, is, Genentech partnered with us and the 2 county offices of ed to say, we know that there is an immediate need right now with the schools, but we also want to help fund the recovery of the education system and give you guys the space that you need to think through what the education system could look like going forward. And so, Genentech, definitely one of those trailblazers who wants to be able to give our education leaders the space to think through, how to be resilient, at the same time respond to the urgent needs in front of us. And I'm hoping that shift is something that's going to happen throughout philanthropy, and not being afraid of doing some of that work.
Thank you.
Julie, if I could just add, I think one of the potential shift in thinking is around developing these long-term partnerships. So even as we are successful in considering how philanthropy might fund positions, for example, funding those positions that could increase and improve the infrastructure of the organization, they need to be longer term funding solutions and relationships, so that our efforts are not vulnerable to the inevitable ups and downs of public funding. So our schools, are pretty much dependent on these very short cycle decisions around public funding of our schools. And that means some of the positions that maybe we would really desperately need, they become vulnerable, and we lose them when there are shifts or downturns in the economy.
That's a really good point. And I want to shift us over to the Q&A, because we've had some really great questions coming in. First from John from Breakthrough. For our county superintendents, how are you envisioning the role for out-of-school time providers as your districts navigate COVID? And how can those organizations be most helpful to supporting critical needs for your districts and students now and in the long term? I think this is a question a lot of people have right now. What does this look like?
Yeah, this needs a traffic cop, right? Everybody's running into the intersection and bumping into each other here, all with the best of intentions. And this is the place where I feel like these navigator positions who understand both systems can really help point the right people. So what we decided after lots and lots of large event convenings and lots of discussion with the out of school time is that we're asking all of our people in the office who have those connections to direct individuals to the superintendent's office so that we can basically play matchmaker. It requires a more intimate and personal conversation between the players, because oftentimes out of school care providers are only in one section of the county or only provide for one school district or something like that. Some are more broad. And so that we're doing a more targeted approach to match the services and resources of the out-of-school providers with the needs that the school districts have. District superintendents are so full up right now with launching school, and it's really a challenge for them to innovate and brainstorm about a whole nother process. So we're doing it that way. Matchmaking in the superintendent's office.
Superintendent Dewan, what does that look like in Santa Clara County?
Well, I think similarly, we have a lot of investment I
think we lost your audio.
Okay, so we have very similar relationships in terms of partnering with our out-of-school time providers, but I think they play such a critical role in providing access to leadership development, arts, outdoor activities, other things that can really supplement the well-being and wellness of children, especially at this time when our schools are so focused on just how to do education and distance learning. So really that intensity of partnership with out-of-school time is going to contribute to the wellness of our children and families.
And a question from Nancy Lau that might be for Avo or Tamara is, how have philanthropies supporting education also thought about supporting teachers? It seems like there's a lot of prep for children and their academic future, but are teachers being given the same level of consideration?
Yeah, I'll just say for us, we rely on Superintendent Magee and Dewan to tell us what their needs are. And if teachers is on top of that list, we want to fund it. So rather than having a separate, view of supporting teachers, we work with our trusted partners to tell us what's needed.
Thank you.
Yeah, for Shortino, we do fund in education, but we are not specialists, and so we're more generalists. So we do fund teacher development programs. We fund nonprofits that are working in collaboration with teachers and districts. So it's a whole menu of different types of approaches. But yeah, definitely pro-teacher.
And I guess the final question that I want to pose to the panel to end this on a hopeful note is quickly, as we work collectively to create a new equitable vision of high quality education in Silicon Valley, what gives you hope? What are some concrete examples of things that are happening that you're seeing that give you hope? Avo, maybe we can start with you on this one.
Yeah, I'm going to start out with a little bit of a chasm that I see first, and I'll pivot to hope. The chasm I'm talking about is the realization that it took a global pandemic for us to know that the economy is tied to education and childcare. And we just recently did a poll of Santa Clara County likely voters, and the top things on their mind is homelessness, cost of living, education, and childcare, in that order. And issues like transportation and public safety and environment are still on the list, but they're not top of mind. And so what I'm hopeful for is that the conversations when we talk about rebuilding our economy and philanthropy following that rebuilding realizes the investment that's needed in our education and childcare systems. Because the conversations I've been a part of so far, and the readings that we hear about are all about job creation and workforce development, all things that are very, very important. But there are prerequisites to job development and workforce development and getting people back to work. And those things are ensuring they have a roof over their head and ensuring that their kids are getting educated and there's childcare available, affordable childcare for them. And that's what our people are saying. And so I'm hoping philanthropy, corporations, and all the leaders in the Valley sort of meet that challenge that all of our residents are facing. So I'm hopeful for that, given the outpouring of support we've seen so far.
Thank you. Tamara?
What gives me hope is that I'm in rooms now with both wealthy white people and also white people who work in philanthropy who are now talking about race and equity in ways that I have never heard before. And so I say, welcome aboard. It gives me a lot of hope. It's incredible to hear, Mr. Sobrato Sr. saying, oh, I went to the County Board of Supervisors to talk about, extending a moratorium on evictions. Okay, that's good. And I need him to get, 40, 50 buddies to get on board too. So I think that's the kind of thing that gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you. Superintendent Dewan?
I think the investments that we've seen with philanthropy, with our cities and towns and the county, really making some immediate investments, significant investments in meeting the immediate needs with digital divide has just been inspiring. To have government and philanthropy stand up together and make a significant contribution right away based on an urgent need. Usually the wheels of those systems move pretty slowly, but we've been able to really generate this type of action and investment. And I think that's going to set a foundation for the future. That gives me hope. I'm really inspired by the partnerships and the public and private investments that have already occurred. And also, I'm really finding a lot of hope and inspiration in our shared willingness to consider what is possible in public education and the remembering of how important education and schools are to the fabric of our community and our democracy. And I am really inspired by the voice of our youth. When our children stand up and tell us how they're experiencing COVID-19, when they ask for what they need, and they feel empowered to share their voice, it gives me a lot of hope. And so that leadership and persistence, I think, can give us a lot of meaning at this time. And I know our community is counting on us, and we have the capacity to serve, lead, and persist.
Thank you. Superintendent Magee?
Well, I agree with Superintendent Dewan right off the bat about the voice of our young people. They're taking to the streets and, raising their voices in ways that are so inspiring about the things that really do need to change, not just in our communities, but across our country. So at the County Office of Education, we're really excited to lean in and embrace an anti-racist paradigm, which is basically moving from sort of the passive equity mode to taking action to break down systems that continue to oppress and divide. And so our staff is really ready for that. We are hiring a position to lead that work, working directly for the superintendent. And then I'm also inspired by the quickness of the partnerships, the way the partnerships, say with Silicon Valley Community Foundation and Genentech, has reached the people who need the help the most. It happened quickly, it was efficient, and very responsive. So I look forward to continuing relationships and partnerships that way.
Thank you. And before David takes us over to the keynote, I just want to call out themes. And the big theme is trust. And the second big theme is leading with race and COVID and education. And then I will do my shameless plug to please vote and please complete the census, because they are two very important things. And please encourage everyone you know in all of your networks far and wide to do the same. David?
Jamie, fantastic facilitation, and this panel lived up to its promise. And I also want to say the attendees, so many leaders in the audience this morning, and your questions really illustrate how much you care about this topic. So thank you to all of you. Right now, you can click on the link that my colleague Tim dropped in the chat box. Thank you so much, Tim, to move over to our closing keynote conversation with Laura Guillot and our new CEO, Ahmad Thomas. Thank you, everyone.